Welcome to the 25th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through how to back up your flows, data sources, and workbooks maintained on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance by downloading them to a location of your choosing using Tableau Server Client. As a server administrator, you could use Tableau's native backup and restore features. However, using the method I am going to walk you through today is arguably more straightforward, accessible to non-server administrators, and can act as an additional safety measure. To showcase how this can be done, let us jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin developing a script that downloads content from my Tableau Cloud instance to my local machine. To get started, I'll need to run this initial configuration block that is responsible for configuring my authentication and server objects. Through those two things, I will authenticate and sign into my Tableau Cloud instance. If you are unfamiliar with how to sign into your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance, then I highly recommend that you watch tutorial 2 of this series where I walk through connecting to my Tableau Cloud instance. Okay, to get to the main purpose of this tutorial, we're going to create a content backup that consists of all of the flows, workbooks, and data sources maintained on my Tableau Cloud instance. So what that looks like is, if I go to my Tableau Cloud instance and I go to Explore, so I'm on the Explore page, I'm expecting to be able to download all of the workbooks, so these 5 workbooks, these 13 data sources, and these 56 flows to my local machine at the file path specified here. So I've done that here. I've basically said I want to download all of my content to a folder called Content Backup that sits within tutorial 25. So I'm going to provide a file path and download all of that content to that file path. Now, this entire process is pretty straightforward and it hinges on the download method for each of the content types corresponding endpoints. So you have server.flows, server.datasources, and server.workbooks. And with each of those endpoints, there is a download method that's very straightforward to use. You're going to pass in a few things. So you need to pass in the ID of the object you're trying to download, the file path, and then you will need to determine whether or not you want to include the extract file. So if you want to include the extract, that's going to be available for workbooks and data sources, and for flows, that's not going to be a parameter for that endpoint, or sorry, for that method at the flows endpoint. But before we can do any of that, we actually have to sign in, right? So to be able to run any of these calls or any of these requests, we need to actually be able to sign into our server. So I'm going to say with server.signin, and this should actually be auth, I believe. So auth.signin. And then I'm going to pass in my Tableau authentication object. And just to confirm this works, I'm going to say server.version. So I'm just going to say print server.version. This is only accessible if you've signed in. And it works, so 3.25. All right, so what we can do is continue with the point of this tutorial, and that's creating this content backup. So like I said, this depends on the download method at each of the endpoints. So to walk through that, let's just do data sources, for example, to start off with. So we'll say server.datasources. And what I mentioned previously, so before we go there, what I mentioned previously is that this download method accepts the data source ID, the file path, and whether or not you want to include the extracts. Now, most people are not going to memorize LUIDs, so locally unique identifiers. These are very long values that you would not want to have to memorize. So what you need to do first to identify which flow you want to download is you need to retrieve that object and extract the ID value. So to do that, we can say data sources is equal to data source or data source and tsc.pager server.datasources. So what this is going to do is it's going to retrieve each of the data source objects on my Tableau Cloud instance, so those 13 data sources, and it's going to put those in a list. So we're using the data sources endpoint to get each of these data source objects. And what we're going to do here in a moment is we're going to iterate through each of these data sources, extract the ID value, pass that into the download method, and that will allow us to download each of these data sources to this path here. So let's do that now. So I'm going to say for data source in data sources, server.datasources.download. And we need 3 things. So, and this actually needs to be server. So I'm using the constant. I'm going to say download, and this is going to be data source ID is equal to data source.id. So this value here, we're extracting the ID attributes maintained for each data source. Now, there is an argument to be made that's why don't we just do this, right? So why don't we just create a list of the data source IDs since that's all we need? You could do that. The reason I'm not doing that here is just to give you an idea of what you could do later. So if you, for example, if you want to do some error handling and you want to specify which data sources or flows or workbooks failed to download, or you want to be able to convey the successes, say workbook X, was successful in downloading or something like that. Well, you need all the attributes, right? You wouldn't want to provide the LUID back to the user as a feedback loop. You need the actual name of the workbook, data source, or flow. So in that case, you could, send back the data source.name, the name attribute maintained for that data source. But so I'm going to do that like this, and I'm going to say download path, or this is file path, and that's going to be equal to download to path, and then include extract is equal to true. All right. So what we're expecting to happen here is we're going to iterate through the list of data sources that we've retrieved using the data sources endpoints. And through each of those iterations, we're going to extract the corresponding data source ID and pass that into the download method so that we can download this to my local machine, and it's going to be downloaded here. So what I'll do is I'm going to try to show this while it's downloading so you can see what's going on. I'm going to run this, and then I'm going to pull up this window here so that we can see the folder the content's being downloaded to. And again, these are just the data sources for right now. So let's go ahead and run this. And what have I put in here wrong? So download to path, download to path. Server has no data sources. Okay, yeah. So I am data sources with a space. They are data sources with no space, one word. So let's go ahead and run this. And you'll see here, they're popping in here, right? They're being downloaded pretty quickly. And you should expect relatively quick download speeds here, like if you have a decent connection. Also, it's going to be dependent, of course, on the size of the extract, right? So if you have a 100 megabyte extract, that may take a minute or two to download. But in real world scenarios, this is a very quick process to create a content backup, even if you have hundreds of data sources. All right, so we've done data sources. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and delete these because we're going to actually walk through a step later on that allows you to download flows, workbooks, and data sources all in one go, as opposed to having to say, I want to download the data sources first, and then I want to download the workbooks, and then the flows. We can do them all in one go or one request. All right, so I'm going to delete those. And the way we're going to do this for flows and workbooks is really just a copy and paste job. So if we think about that, so what is that going to look like? Well, let's just create or gather our list of workbooks and flows. So I'm going to do this 2 more times. And again, this goes back to me saying this all hinges on the download method for each of those corresponding endpoints. So I'm going to say, let's just do workbooks here. And I'm going to say workbook for workbook. It's probably actually faster to type this than it is for me to replace each of these things. So I'm going to say server.workbooks because we're going to use the workbooks endpoint to gather the workbooks. And I'm going to say workbook. Should just do a replace, but at this point I'm already halfway there. We're going to use the workbooks endpoint. This should be plural. So list of workbooks. This is going to be the workbook ID. This is going to be our workbook ID that we're extracting from each of the workbooks. File path is the same, include extract is the same. There is extracts for workbooks depending on if you've embedded them or what options you've chosen when publishing. Okay, so same idea. Create a list of workbook objects that we retrieve using the workbooks endpoint. Then we're going to iterate through each of those workbooks. We're going to use the download method at the workbook endpoint, and this should actually be plural. We're going to pass in each of the workbook IDs that we extract from those objects. We're going to download it to the path that we've already used. We're going to include the extract. Okay, so just what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do the flows too. Just go ahead and do this real quick. So flow for flow, same exact pattern. So replace this with the flows endpoint. We're going to say for flow and flows. We're going to use the flows endpoint again, the download method. This will be the flow ID. We'll extract the flow ID, download it to that path, and this doesn't actually exist. This is not a parameter for this method at the flows endpoint. All right, so if I run through this, we're basically going to get all of our data sources, all of our workbooks, and all of our flows downloaded to our machine. That's the goal. That's essentially your content backup. Now, After I run this, what I will do really quickly is I'll speed up this video so you don't have to watch me type, but it's probably smart to put this in a function called download content and then give the user the ability to choose the content type they want to download, whether that be all or just the data sources, just the flows, or just the workbooks. All right, and then maybe put some error handling in there, say if they provide a value that is neither of those options, data sources, flows, workbooks, or all. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And let's watch here. All right, so we have data sources first. There's our 13 data sources. We're getting flows now. We have a few workbooks. So we have the North America Sales Workbook, a package workbook. We're getting a ton of flows because we had 56 flows. This was part of a hackathon that I entered. Those 50 restore me's, they're basically duplicate flows. But here we have it. We have what do we have in here? So we have 74 items. How many do we have on our server? 56, 13, 5. So I believe that actually is going to give us exactly what we're expecting, 74. So 56, 13, 5, 74. So we've downloaded all of our content. We have our content backup successfully created. And the benefit to this, again, is if you are not a server administrator, you cannot create the legitimate backup and restore that comes natively with Tableau Server. And that's a big thing. Very few people are server administrators, but there's a high likelihood if you're involved in this, if you're creating workbooks, data sources, you're probably publishing them yourself, so you're a creator. So you have a creator license, and you have access to these endpoints, right? You have access to the data sources endpoint, you have access to the workbooks and the flows endpoint, and you can use the API, right? As long as you're allowed to use tokens within your organization. Okay, I've actually decided instead of providing a sped up version of me wrapping this in nice and neat into a function, I'm just going to showcase it on my GitHub. So on my GitHub, you're going to be able to find all of my tutorials related to this series. So I've walked through this 25th tutorial so far, and there's going to be plenty of content on here, starting with connecting to your server for the first time, generating reports, depending on the content type, refreshing data, so triggering extracts, refreshing extracts, running link tasks, running flows, adding, updating, and removing data sources, favorites, flows, what have you. And finally, where we're at today, and in this tutorial, we're talking about bridging the gaps. So bridging the gaps, what I mean by that is I'm trying to develop means that bridge the gaps between what Tableau's software and services currently offer and what my teams and organizations and my peers need, right? So in this case, we're creating a content backup that you can do without being a server administrator. In that case, it's going to be sitting in the content backup folder within bridging the gaps folder. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see what I was going to provide a sped up version of me wrapping this into a nice and neat function. So here's a file. Basically, it's ready to go. Besides the authentication aspect, you obviously need to configure that to work for you. But I've wrapped it in a function that's called download content, accepts 4 parameters, which you should be familiar with. So the server we're connecting to, the authentication mechanism, which you will configure yourself, the download path where we're going to download the content to, and the type of content. So this is a huge benefit in my opinion, because if I want to say I want to just download my workbooks or just download my flows or just download my data sources, I can do that, or I can download them all, right? So the default value in this case is going to be all. But if I do want to download just one particular content type, I can choose to do so. So it's very straightforward. There's nothing like crazy about this. It's a lot of copying and pasting actually, right? So if the default value is used all, we just run through the script we just created, right? So we're going to download all of the data sources using the data sources endpoint, download all the flows using the flows endpoint, the same thing for the workbooks. And those are going to all be downloaded to the file path provided. Now, if the content type provided by the user is data sources, well, just going to download the data sources. Same thing for flows, same thing for workbooks. So then you have the main method, of course, and that's where we're going to configure or provide the token name, token value. So that's for your authentication. How are you going to authenticate with your server or cloud instance? Well, you need a token. The site ID, so in this case, SQL short reads, that's my site, right? So SQL short reads here. And then the server object, right? So which server am I connecting to? So 10AX, part of the developer program. Use server version true. So use the most up-to-date API version associated with the server. So which one does it support? And of course, here we go. So here's going to be our function. We're going to call our function download content. Server is equal to server, authentication is equal to authentication, download path is equal to the download path we've provided, and the content type in this example, I've passed in data sources. So what is that going to do? That's going to jump to this and download just the data sources. Put all in there or don't provide any value at all, it's going to download everything. So your flows, workbooks, and data sources. You can trick this out further, right? So you can actually build onto this. You can say, hey, I want to download all my content, but just within this parent project or just within this particular project. So in Tableau terms, project is a folder on your file system. In this case, it's a folder on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance. You can do it like that. You can do specific projects. You can do the content of a specific person. Just build onto this function, right? So specific person, you would get the owner ID, right? So who owns that content? It's pretty straightforward, and expanding on this idea, super easy. Use the necessary endpoints. All right, that wraps up this video on creating a content backup programmatically through Tableau Server clients. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance through automation. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.